B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Moed Katan Daf base, and we're going to start from the very first Mishnah of the Masechta. And this Masechta, the first part of the Masechta, is going to be discussing primarily the halachas of Chol HaMoed. Chol HaMoed are those days between the first and last day of Pesach and between the first and last day of Sukkot. And the Gemara tells us in Chagiga Daf Yud Ches, and this is learned from Psukim, that certain melachos are osir, but not everything is osir. And the Gemara says that Lo Mosron Hakosov Elo LeChachomim, the Torah left it to our Chachomim to give us the guidelines what's mutter on Chol HaMoed and what is osir on Chol HaMoed. And that's going to be the discussion of this perek. Says the Mishnah, Mashkin Beis Hashlochin. There are two different types of fields amongst others, but there's a Beis Hashlochin, which is an irrigated field, which means it's a field that cannot really survive solely on rainwater, and it needs to be irrigated with reservoirs of water, with streams flowing from them. One has to go out of one's way to give water to those fields. In contrast to a Stei Beis Habal, Stei Beis Habal is a field which is naturally irrigated, and it does not need, naturally watered I should say, and does not need to be watered by man. And obviously a Stei Beis Habal, even though adding water may improve the field and the fruits, and may make the fruits ripen faster, but the field would not get ruined. However, in the case of a Beis Hashlochin, which is a field which is dependent on the rain given by man, if we were not going to water it when necessary, then the field and the fruits could get ruined, and therefore there's a discussion, there's more leniency, and it's mutter to be mashkin Beis Hashlochin b'moed on Chol HaMoed. Ubashvies, and we'll see in the Gemara also, but even in Shemitah, where many melachos are osir, as we're going to learn. However, to water this field in order that the field and the crops should not get ruined is something which is allowed even in Shemitah. Bein mimayon sheyotzo b'tchila, bein mimayon shelo yotzo b'tchila. Mayon is a spring. Typically, at some point, a spring would start gushing forth, and then it would find its way and create for itself a type of a stream, a path through which the waters can flow in whichever direction they're going to go. And when the waters first start flowing, then arranging and directing the water would mean digging a type of a channel and making a path. Then that it could include, if things don't go right, don't go as planned, and the walls of this stream fall in, it could increase the amount of work a person has to do, the amount of effort he has to do. And one of the big rules of Hilchas Chol HaMoed is that excessive effort is osir. However, a May on a spring, which is lo yotzo b'tchila, which means it's not now coming forth for the first time. This is a spring that's already come forth and has its path, and therefore there's very little work involved with channeling the water towards the field, and therefore it's easier. But the Mishnah says that one is allowed to water the field, this Beis Hashlochin, bein mimayon sheyotzo b'tchila, bein mimayon shelo yotzo b'tchila. Both those types of springs, a spring that is now coming out for the first time and one that's not coming out for the first time, one is allowed to water the Beis Hashlochin because it's a davar ha'oved. If you don't do it, the crops, the field could get ruined. However, says the Mishnah, aval ein mashkin, one's not allowed to water a field, lo mimei geshomim v'lo mimei kiloin, not from reservoirs of rainwater and not from a well. And regarding the well, because having to bucket pail by pail of water from the well and put it onto the field is excessive work, and excessive work is one of the things which is not allowed to be done under normal circumstances on Chol HaMoed. About the Mea Geshomim, if you have a big reservoir of rainwater, why that would be different from the springs mentioned before in the Mishnah, that's something which is going to be discussed in the Gemara. Continues the Mishnah, Ve'ein oisin ugiyois lagefanim, they would typically dig ditches around the base of a grapevine in order to allow the water to collect there, and that way the roots will get the water they need. One's not allowed to dig those ditches on Chol HaMoed. Rabbi ben Azariah, one's not allowed to dig out a stream at first on Chol HaMoed, which means that once, we'll see exactly in contrast to what this halacha is, but they would dig out streams for the water to go through and irrigate the fields. One's not allowed to originally dig out such a stream on Chol HaMoed, ubeshvius nor on Shemitah. The Chachamim say, you are allowed to dig such a stream on Shvius, just not on Chol HaMoed. And those streams that are damaged, they get blocked, then one is allowed to fix them on Chol HaMoed. Says the Mishnah, when there's an issue with the waters that are collecting in public places, one's allowed to fix them on Chol HaMoed, one's allowed to clear them out, because the need to have available drinking water is a public need and is important. One's allowed to fix the roads, if there's road works that need doing, the streets, mikvois hamayim, and the mikvois, to make sure there's enough water, there's 40 saw of water in the mikvah. And any of other needs of the public, one's allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. One is allowed to mark where there's a kever, where there's a corpse or part of a corpse that's been buried, and if one doesn't mark it, a kohen could by mistake hover over it, and then if he's holding truma, the truma will become tomei, he won't be able to eat truma, he'll become tomei, and therefore they would mark around the graves, and one's allowed to mark them even on Chol HaMoed. V'yotzin af ala kilayim, the agents of Beis Din would go out on Chol HaMoed to inspect whether the fields, whether there's kilayim growing in the fields. Kilayim is a mix of different vegetations that are not allowed to be grown together in close proximity, and they will check whether there is kilayim in the fields and take care of them according to the halacha, and we'll see more about all these details in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Hashta yesh loimar mimayon sheyotza b'tchila de'osi le'in pulei mashkin mimayon shelo yotza b'tchila de'lo le'in pulei miboya. And here the Gemara is asking a question from the sequence in the Mishnah. The Mishnah started that one's allowed to water a beis hashloch in an irrigated field with a mayon from a stream sheyotza b'tchila, which is now for the first time running through on this path, and bein mimayon she lo yotza b'tchila, even a spring that's been there before. And it would seem that once you say in the Mishnah you're allowed to even water a field that is going through this, that is coming out, the water is coming out for the first time on Chol HaMoed, of course a stream that's already come out in the past, of course you're allowed to water with it. And so that should be taken for granted. Why did the Mishnah have to add that bein mimayon shelo yotza b'tchila after you've already said that a mayon sheyotza b'tchila is allowed? Let's see that again. Hashta, if now yesh loimar, it would be taken for granted that once you've said that mimayon sheyotza b'tchila, that of a stream that is coming out for the first time, de'osi le'in puli, where such a stream, there's a risk of the walls of this stream caving in. And nonetheless, mashkin, we're not afraid it's going to cave in, because if it does cave in, there's going to be a very lot of extra work, which would be osor and Chol HaMoed. And nonetheless, we're not afraid that's going to happen. And mashkin, you're allowed to water the field from such a stream, from such a spring, mimayon shelo yotza b'tchila, then a type of spring where this is not the first time it's coming out, de'lo le'in puli, and there's no risk of the walls of that stream caving in, miboya. Can we not take it for granted that you can water from there on Chol HaMoed? So why does the Mishnah have to tell it to us? Answers the Gemara, Omri, Yitzchok. There is an element of chiddush in that second statement in the Mishnah. Because if it would only say, which would seem to be the bigger chiddush, that you're allowed to be mashkin beis hashaloch in an irrigated field, you're allowed to water from, or even from a spring which is now yotza b'tchila, I may have thought, hava amina, I would have said, hacha, only in such a type of a spring where there is risk of the walls caving in, who only in that case, the beis hashalochin in, that you're only allowed to water an irrigated field with such a spring, but beis habal, but a type of a field which is naturally watered, loi, you wouldn't be allowed to water another type of a field that doesn't rely so much on this spring. You're not allowed to use this type of a spring, you're not allowed to work with this water on Chol HaMoed, mishum de'osi le'in pule, because we're afraid that the walls will cave in, and it's not really so necessary in a stay base hashloch, in a stay base habal, to do such. The field doesn't need that water. But I may have thought that avol mayon shelo yotza b'tchila. I may have thought that a type of a spring where there's no risk of the walls caving in, because it's not a new path that this spring is choosing now. De'le'osi le'in pule. There's no risk of the walls caving in. I may have said, afilu beis habal nami. You're even allowed to water a stay beis habal, a field that doesn't rely so much on this water. Even nonetheless, you'd be allowed to water it on Chol HaMoed, because there's no risk of the walls caving in. Komash malon. That's why the Mishnah tells us that lo yishno mayon sheyotza b'tchila, v'lo yishno mayon shelo yotza b'tchila. There's no difference what type of spring. Even a spring which is not coming out for the first time, only beis hashalochin in, you're only allowed to water with it a field called beis hashalochin, which is an irrigated field, a field that relies on this water, and beis habal loy, but a field which is more a lower down field where the rain water is sufficient for that type of field. In that case, you're not allowed to water on Chol HaMoed, even from a spring which is not choosing its path for the first time. Continues the Gemara. Umay mashma. Why is it? Well, what would be the source? Dehai beis hashalochin, that the word shalochin that we're using, and we were translating it as an irrigated field, lishna de tzachusahi. Where do you see that beis hashalochin is, the word shalochin is a term of being thirsty, and a thirsting field, which means a field which is not satisfied by the rain and needs to be irrigated by man. So where would we see that the word shlochin actually means thirst? Says the Gemara D'chsiv, it says in the pasuk, Asher korcho baderech vayzaniv b'cho kol hanechesholim acharecho v'ata, and you were oyef, you were weak, you were faint, v'yogea, and exhausted. V'lo yorei elikim. Umatarguminon, the targum of va'at oyef v'yogea is va'at meshalhi v'loi. So you see that oyef, which is faint and sort of thirsty and weak, is the word meshalhi, and the he and the ches often are interchanged with each other. So you see that meshalhi means thirsting. So beis hashlochin means a thirsty field. Umay mashma, what would be the source? Dehai beis habal, that the word beis habal is lishna demay sufusahu, that it's the term of being settled, of being a field which is okay for itself. It doesn't need to be externally watered, it is naturally watered from the rain. Because it says in the pasuk in Yeshaya, Ki yiv'al bochur besula, yiv'alucha bonaich, u'mesois choson al kala yosis olayich eloikoich. And the targum for the word ki yiv oil bochur basula, ki yiv al bochur basula, is arei kamod de mitoisav ulam im basulta yisaisvun begaveich bonaich. So you see here that the word ki yiv al, which is from the same term as the beis habal, is a term used to be settled, and it's where everything is rested and at peace. So you see that in this pasuk, and that's why beis habal is a field that's not needy, and a beis hashlochin is a needy field, one that needs to be irrigated. Continues the Gemara. Man Tana, we're soon going to see a number of Tanoim. We're first going to have Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and then we'll have Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. We have 4 different Tanoim, and we're wondering which one of these Tanoim could actually be the author of our Mishnah. And if you had to sum up the beginning of our Mishnah in terms of the halachas of Chol HaMoed, what do we see? We see, number one, that there's a difference between Beis HaShalochin and Beis Habal. That Beis HaShalochin, there's a hefsed, there's a loss if you don't water it, and Beis Habal, there's no loss. It would only be harvacha, it would be extra benefit and profit, but wouldn't actually be saving from a loss. That's one thing that we see in the Mishnah. You're only allowed to work on Chol HaMoed for something which is to prevent a loss, not for extra benefit and gain. That's one thing we see. And we also see that even Beis HaShalochin itself, you're allowed to exert a certain amount of effort, but not too much. That, for example, the watering the field from the Mei Geshomim and Mei Akiloin, which would be bucket by bucket, taking the water out of a well, that you're not allowed to do, even for a beis hashilochin. The question is, which Tana holds that for harvacha nothing is mutter, for hefsed it's mutter but not tircha yasera, not an excessive amount of effort. Man Tana de pseida in harvacha loy. Which Tana holds that to prevent a loss, one's allowed to work on Chol HaMoed, but not for extra profit? And even where it could be a loss, mitrach nami lo torchinon, an over amount of effort is also not allowed on Chol HaMoed. Which Tana would this be? Omer Rav Huna suggested Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov did none. We're going to learn in a Mishnah on Daf Vav. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer. Moishchin es hamayim, one's allowed to draw the water mi'ilon le'ilon. If there's a pool of water which is stationed at the base, at the roots of one of the trees, you're allowed to make a little ditch and allow the water to travel to the next tree, because all the trees need water. And an ilon has the same status of a beis hashlochin, where every tree needs to be given its water. The field as a whole, not necessarily, but from either trees do need it. Ubilvad shelo yashkes hasodeh kulo. But you're not allowed to water the whole field. We're talking about a stei habal. The trees in a stei habal have the status of a beis hashlochin because they need the water, but the rest of the field doesn't need it. And therefore, you're not allowed to water the rest of the field. That's what Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says. So what do we see from here? He says clearly that for pseida, to prevent a loss, you're allowed to work on Chol HaMoed, but not in order to gain extra profits. Says the Gemara, you're right. As far as the first concept, the difference between beis hashlochin and beis habal, indeed, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds that way. But the second detail, that in the case of a beis hashlochin, that you're not allowed to do an over amount of work, that you didn't see. Eimer de shamislei l'Rebbi Eliezer. All you see for Rabbi Eliezer is harvacha deloy, that if the work you're doing is only to make extra profit, that's asa. Tircha, but to do extra amount of work, or not to be allowed to do an extra amount of effort, b'mokim pseida, in a field that would get damaged if you didn't, mishamasle. How do you know that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov would say it's osir, as our Mishnah says? Elam Rav Papa argues with Rav Huna and says that the Tana of our Mishnah is not necessarily Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, ha mani Rabbi Yehuda. It's actually Rabbi Yehuda in the coming brisa. The Tanya we learned in the brisa. Ma'yon hayotza b'tchila. That means with the content, the context, and it's important to remember this, of this brisa, is we're discussing primarily this type of a spring that was mentioned in the Mishnah, that it's a ma'yon hayotza b'tchila. It's the first time this spring is choosing its path and watering a field with it and channeling the water towards the field could, if the walls collapse in, it could be a lot of extra work, and that's the discussion of this brisa. A ma'yon hayotza b'tchila. Mashkin mimenu, you're allowed to water from it, afilu stei beis habal. Clearly not like in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that mashkin beis hashalochin and a beis habal you're not allowed to. But Divrei Reb Meir holds that even though it's a ma'yon hayotza b'tchila, you're allowed to, and there is a risk of the walls caving in, you're allowed to even water with it a field which is a beis habal, a field that would not get ruined if you didn't do it. Reb Meir says it's mutter. And there's a discussion exactly what Reb Meir means. According to the Ran says that Reb Meir assumes that every stay beis habal has a certain element of hefsed in it, but that's not the discussion we need to go into now. So that's the opinion of Reb Meir, clearly not like our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda argues with Reb Meir and says, Ein mashkin elo stay beis hashlochin shechareva. Only a sodeh field of a beis hashlochin which is dried out, it's craving for rain, or not for rain, for water, it's thirsting for water, you're allowed to, that's the only type of field that you're allowed to water on Chol HaMoed. And that conforms with our Mishnah, that only a beis hashlochin, not a beis habal. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Omer, loikach v'loikach. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says that even a stay base, well, we'll soon see exactly what loikach v'loikach, what that means. But Rabbi Eliezer is going to say that even a beis hashalochin, loikach v'loikach means that irrespective of whether it's chareva or not chareva, whether it's thirsting or not thirsting, you're not allowed to water a field. And again, that's not like our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says you are allowed to water a beis hashilochin. Yeser al kain Omar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda adds on and says, not only are you only allowed to water a beis hashilochin, not beis habal, but also lo yifne odom amas hamayim v'yashke leginosoi ulechurvosoi. And Tosfos explains what this means is that even a beis hashilochin, even a place that needs to be watered, and you're allowed to water from a mayon sheyotza b'tchila, but you're not allowed to actually clean away the stream where the water is flowing along in order for the water to get to the field, because that is a tircha yasera, it's an excessive amount of effort which is osur on chol hamoed. Says the Gemara, Mai chorva, we saw that Rabbi Yehuda said that you're allowed to be mashkin only a beis hashilochin shechorva, that's dried out. What does that mean? Ilei mechorva mamish, does it mean that the field is totally dried out? Lo molida mashkila. Why would I be allowed to water that on Chol HaMoed? Once a field is totally dried out, it's ruined. Nothing's going to grow there anymore. It's not going to help just to water it. Omar Abaye says what it means is shechorvo mimayon zeh v'yotzalo mayon acher. It means that one of the springs that were watering this field had dried out, and now a different spring had come forth and is watering the field. So Rabbi Yehuda says that this type of field, which is used to getting water, then you're allowed to water it with this new spring that's just emerged. You're allowed to water this field because it's a hefsed. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah oimer, lo yikach v'lo yikach. When we saw in the Brisa that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, not like this and not like this, and either way it's osur, what does he mean? Lo yishna chorav mayono, v'lo yishna lo chorav mayono. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says that it doesn't matter if the original spring is dried out or not. Mayon sheyotza b'tchila loy, any new spring that comes forth, you're not allowed to water a field with it. He seems to hold that mayon sheloyotza b'tchila, which means a type of a stream which is already a spring, which has already got its set path, that's okay. There's no risk of the walls caving in, there's no risk of extra work, and therefore it's mutter. Our Mishnah clearly says that mashkin beis hashilochin, even from a mayon sheyotza b'tchila. So it's clear it would seem clear that Rabbi Yehuda, who says that from a mayon hayotza b'tchila, that your mashkin beis hashilochin and not beis habal, and even a beis hashilochin you're not allowed to do lo yafne odom amas ma'amayim because it's extra work, so which would parallel and correspond to the type of effort of mei geshomim and mei kiloin mentioned in the Mishnah. It would seem clear, and this is what Rav Papa suggested, that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah holds that you're never allowed to water a field, you're never allowed to water a field from a mayon which is yotza b'tchila. Not like it says in our Mishnah. Now the Gemara is asking, umimai. It's true that you saw in this brisa that you're only allowed to water according to Rabbi Yehuda, you're only allowed to water a beis hashilochin and not a beis habal. But we'll remember, what was the first words of this brisa? Mayon hayotza b'tchila. The brisa is primarily discussing only a mayon hayotza b'tchila. So Dilma, maybe Adkan lo k'omer Rabbi Yehuda, maybe Rabbi Yehuda only says that beis hashilochin in u beis habal loy. When does Rabbi Yehuda say that a beis hashilochin you're allowed to water and a beis habal loy is elom mayon sheyotza b'tchila? Only in context of this brisa, which is a mayon sheyotza b'tchila. And the reason for that would be Dilma osile in puleg, because maybe the walls of the stream will cave in, there'll be a lot of extra work, and therefore beis habal, where it's not so necessary to water it, you're not allowed to water it from such a spring on Chol HaMoed. Aval mayon shelo yotza b'tchila, but a type of a spring where it's not the first time that it's flowing through this path, there's no risk of the walls caving in. Afil beis habal nami, maybe even a beis habal you would be allowed to water from it, and that would be not like our Mishnah, where the Mishnah says explicitly that only beis hashilochin you're allowed to water from either of these types of springs. Says the Gemara that you're right, that your diuk, it could have a place, but if you're right, then we don't have any author for our Mishnah. Imkein masnisin aman tarmaya. Who are you going to attribute our Mishnah to? Elol Rabbi Yehuda, it must be, that means the only choice we have is Rabbi Yehuda. Is of all the 4 Tanoim we've mentioned, the only one that would make sense is Rabbi Yehuda, and it must be according to Rabbi Yehuda, Lo yishno mayon sheyotzo b'tchila, v'lo yishno mayon shelo yotzo b'tchila, in both types of springs, beis hashlochin in, beis habal loy. Only a beis hashlochin, not a beis habal. If so, you're asking, why is the Rabbi Yehuda only talking about beis hashlochin? V'haidik toni mayon, why he's only talking about a mayon sheyotzo b'tchila? V'haidik toni mayon sheyotzo b'tchila, lo yidiach ha'koichoi de Reb Meir, is in order to impress on us how lenient Reb Meir is. Even a type of a spring, which is the first time it's on this path through the field, nonetheless, mashkin mimenu, you're allowed to water from it. Even a type of field where there would be no losses and damages. If you didn't do it, it would still be mutter according to Reb Meir. And that's why the Brisa and Rabbi Yehuda focuses primarily on this type of on this mayon sheyotza b'tchila, but not to say that according to Rabbi Yehuda, a mayon shelo yotza b'tchila would be allowed by a beis habal, a stei habal. Continues the Gemara, Itmar, hamenachish v'hamashke, and we'll see later why the Gemara brought this in. But the Mishnah is the Gemara is starting with a quote, with a statement. Hamenachish v'hamashke mayim lizroim. If somebody does one of 2 things, either he weeds, which is menachish, or mashke, or he waters, lizroim, by the roots of something growing, b'Shabbos, and he does this on Shabbos, mishomayim masrin beit. The Gemara is asking that doing it on Shabbos, it's clearly a melacha on Shabbos, which is awesome, but which melacha is it? And knowing which melacha is important, because when you give somebody hasra, when you see somebody being mechal Shabbos, it's important that you tell him, stop doing melacha X, whichever melacha it is. You have to know which melacha it is. So it's a machlekes Rabbi and Rav Yosef. Rabbi omer mishum chayrish. Rabbi says that it's similar to plowing. You're not allowed to plow on Shabbos. Rav Yosef omer mishum zorea. It's like sowing, planting. It's similar to planting. And before we continue, this was the opening statement of this sugya, menachish v'mashke, and the Gemara is first going to discuss then menachish, and then the Gemara is going to discuss the mashke, and from the mashkin we're going to get back to our Mishnah. But that's the framework of this sugya. So we had Rabbi Rav Yosef. Rabbi says that weeding and watering is similar to plowing. Rav Yosef says that weeding or watering is similar to planting. Omar Rabbi says, Kavasi didi mistabra. It's probable, like I said, that weeding and watering is associated to plowing. Ma darka shel chayrish. In the same way as it's common, what does charisha, what does plowing do? Lirupuya ara, it softens the land in preparation to be able to plant in it. Hainami, also pulling out the weeds and also watering the earth. Lirupuya ara, it softens the earth, and therefore it is a toilda, so to speak, a child, so to speak, a subcategory of chayrish. Omer Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, no, kavasididi mistabra, it's more probable like I said. Ma darka shel zareah, in the same way as when you plant litzmucha peira, it's in order for fruits and plants to grow. Hochanamim, so too. When you weed a field, it's in order that the things should grow better. When you water a field, it's in order that they should grow. And therefore, and matzmach peira, these also, menachish and mashke, they cause the fruits and the plants and the crops to grow, and therefore, menachish and mashke would be subcategories of the melacha of zoyreah. Omar le Abaya, le Rabba. Abaya said to Rabba, L'ditcho Kashya, I've got a question against you. L'ul Rav Yosef Kashya. And to you, Rav Yosef, I've also got a question. L'ditcho Kashya, you Rabba, I'm asking, Mishum Chayrish in Mishum Zareah Loi, why are you assuming that Menachish and Mashke are only Chayrish, should also be Zareah? Because it's true that it's softening the earth, but it's also causing the plants to grow. Rav Yosef Kashin, on Rav Yosef I've got a question. Mishum Zareah in Mishum Chayrish Loi, is Menachish and Mashke only similar to Zareah, not to Chayrish? It should be both. And Abaya now adds, V'chitema, are you going to say Kol Heicha de Ikatarity, whenever you've got 2 types of melachas, a single activity that could correspond or could represent 2 melachas, Loi Mechayve Elachoda, that he's only going to be chayav for one, and the Machlekes Rabbi and Rav Yosef was just which one? V'omer Rav Kahana, it's not true. Did Rav Kahana not say that zomer, if somebody trims the branches, trims the tree, v'tzorich le'etzim, and he needs the wood. Sometimes you trim a plant, a bush, a tree, just in order that the woods shouldn't be on the branch, shouldn't be on the tree. And if you do that, you'll be chayav for noitea, for planting, because you're making the plants, the crops grow better. But if you don't want that's if you don't want the woods. But if you do want the wood, you're also chayav for koitzer, for reaping. When you reap something, you want what you're taking down. So if he's trimming, which is helping the tree, what remains, it's helping it grow better. And he wants the wood, chayav shtayim, you're chayav for two melachas. Achas mishum noitea, one for, so to speak, for planting, for sowing, because you're making what's left grow better. V'achas mishum koitzer, and also reaping because you want the wood. Kasha, and this is a question which stays a question, the Gemara doesn't tell us an answer. This was a reservation Abaya had against Rabbi and Rav Yosef. Either way, Eisvei Rav Yosef l'Rabbi. Rav Yosef, who said that menachesh, and now we're going to speak exclusively about menachesh, which is weeding. That Rabbi said that when one weeds, one is chayav because of chayrish, and Rav Yosef says you're chayav mishum zayreah. So Rav Yosef is asking to Rabbi. That we learnt as follows in a brisa. Hamenachesh, if somebody weeds, v'amachape, or if somebody covers over the roots, lekilaim, of a field where there's kilaim, which is a mixture of plantation which is not allowed to be grown together, then if somebody's doing menachesh, loika, then you chayav malchus. Rabbi Kiva adds and says, Af hamekayim, even if you just maintain it and you don't do anything with it, you're also loika, you're also chayav. So now Rav Yosef is asking to Rabbi, Bishlei Meledidi, according to me, Rav Yosef, Da'amina mishum zareah, I say that menachesh weeding is actually a form of planting, it's zareah. Hainu da'asira zri b'kilayim. That zriya b'kilayim, then it makes sense. It says in the brisa regarding kilayim that you're chayav. If you're menachesh u'mechape lekilayim loika. So Rav Yosef is saying to Rabbi, according to me, it makes sense that you're loika. You get malchus because it's zoreah. You're not allowed to plant kilayim. Elo leditchoba, according to you, Rabbi, the omrus mishum chayrish, you say that menachesh weeding is not considered planting; it's just considered plowing. Charisha b'kilayim miasir. Do we find any type of issa to plow a field in order to plant kilayim? You're not allowed to plant kilayim, but when you're plowing, there's no kilayim there, so there's no issa of charisha by kilayim. So how can you, Rabbi, understand menachesh v'mechape lekilayim loika if you hold that menachesh is chayfer chafir b'kilayim is loika? Omar le mishum mekayim. So Rabbi answered to Rav Yosef that menachesh v'mechape you're chayav not for the act of actually doing the weeding or the covering, but it's just what you're doing. You are sort of maintaining kilayim, and if you maintain kilayim, then and weeding and covering up the roots, that is a type of a maintaining of the kilayim, and that's why you're chayav. And indeed, he is doing chayrish, but chayrish is not an issa that applies to kilayim. Maintaining is kilayim. Asks the Gemara, but did we not see in the brisa that the continuation of this brisa is that Rabbi Kiva oimer af hamekayim? Rabbi Kiva says not only do you get malchus for menachesh u'mechape, but also for maintaining. Michlal, we can assume from the words of Rabbi Kiva, the Tanakama, that the original Manda Oma in the Mishnah, in the Brisa, lav mishum mekayim, who is chayav not for mekayim, for maintaining, but for the actual menachesh u'mechape. And then Rav Yosef's question comes back and says, if menachesh is chayrish, how can you get malchus for plowing kilayim? Kilayim doesn't know about an issa of charisha. Answers the Gemara, kula Rabbi Kiva. The whole Brisa is Rabbi Kiva, and it's only because of mekayim. And this is how Rabbi has to learn. According to Rav Yosef, there's no problem. Rav Yosef says, menachesh u'mechape lekilayim is going to be loika because of zoreah. But according to Rabbi, who doesn't have zoreah, he would say chayrish, and there's no chayrish by kilayim. It's only because of mekayim, of maintaining. Umay ta'amak omar. Even though it looks like the Bryce has got two opinions, a Tanakama and Rabbi Kiva, no. It's just a Mai Tama. Rabbi Kiva is just explaining the reasoning of the halacha stated before. Umay Tama ka'omar. Why is a person going to get malchus if he's menachesh or mechape by kilayim? Mishum mekayim, because he's maintaining the kilayim. Shere Rabbi Akiva omer, because Rabbi Akiva said, af hamekayim, even somebody who maintains kilayim is chayev. My Talmud Rabbi Akiva, what would be the source for Rabbi Akiva that just maintaining kilayim is chayev? The Tanya we learned in a braysa that it says in the pasuk, Sodcha lo yisizra kilayim. You're not allowed to plant kilayim in your field. Ein li'ela zoreah. If you just read that pasuk at face value, it just says you're not allowed to plant kilayim. Mekayim minayin. How do you know there's an issa even to maintain kilayim? Talmud loimer. So we change around the words in the pasuk a bit, and it's as if it says kilayim sodcha loy. We play around with the words. And there are many different explanations in the Rishonim exactly how the Gemara came to this conclusion, because of the extra words, because of a sequence in the pasuk. But either way, Talmud loime kilayim sod chaloi, that from these we can arrange the words in this pasuk as if it says kilayim in your field loy. Nothing to do with the zariah. Even without actually planting the kilayim, you're not allowed to do anything that's going to maintain the kilayim, and therefore this is the source, according to Rabbi Akiva, that if you do anything to maintain the kilayim, you're also chayev. And in Yitzchok Hashem, in the next shiur, we're going to continue from here.